Kia ora, and welcome to my chorus for Wednesday, October the 1st. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is a podcast and video I produce for paying subscribers to the Kaka, which is an email newsletter that goes out via Substack about Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate and poverty. Now you might recall that housing, climate and poverty doesn't obviously imply an interest in electricity, but I think the electricity market, electricity prices, energy poverty, deindustrialisation and essentially monopoly rent seeking are right at the heart of our major problems in our economy and our society. We know that for at least 20 years, and certainly in the last couple of years, electricity price inflation has run much faster than inflation generally, and it has put households and businesses under enormous pressure. And it seems strange when almost all of this electricity is generated from plants that were built decades ago and have been long paid for. And we shouldn't have a shortage of electricity that pushes up the prices. It's worth looking at how the electricity sector is structured and why we have problems before we look at the announcements today from the government of so-called electricity market reforms. And this is relevant because unless we can solve this issue of a rent-seeking sector that has effectively captured what were public assets and is now generating a type of tax increase that is distorting not just our economy, but is unfairly punishing those who can least afford to deal with higher prices. And you only need to hear the stories of people who are turning off their heaters in the middle of winter to know that this is a crisis, or hear about the factories closing down as they did last winter and have again this winter, including just yesterday the confirmation of over 100 jobs lost in Tokoroa. So the sector is of course dominated by four so-called gentailers. Now these are electricity companies that generate electricity and then they sell it through the lines network. So that's why they're called gentailers. Now the market was set up to allow independent retailers to come in who didn't necessarily have their own generation, but be able to buy off a wholesale market and then compete with those same gentailers as retailers. That was a theory. It's never worked in practice, despite so many attempts by so many players. And that's because effectively the gentailers control the market and are able to drip feed electricity supply into the market to keep the marginal price as high as they want to generate super profits. And they can do this because they own the lakes and effectively those power plants that are connected to the lakes, and some wind farms and some hydroelectric, and a few, of course, coal and gas-fired plants. And in recent years, they have chosen to make those super profits, pay out huge dividends, much higher than you should normally get from a utility business, to shareholders. Now, the sector has those four main companies, three of which are 51% controlled by the state. That is, of course, Meridian, Mercury and Genesis. It's Contact, which is the fully privately owned one. And for both Labour and national governments over the last decade, those super profits and really big dividends have been an important way to control their deficits, to reduce their deficit spending, and to pursue an overall aim of restricting the size of government to less than 30% of GDP. And even though consumers and businesses, small and large, have complained constantly and have been pleading with the government to make the market more competitive and to get more electricity generation into the market, the government has, and I'm not just talking about the current one, the previous Labour government did it as well, have made announcements, made tweaks, wagged fingers, sent rude letters to people to give the impression that they were doing something, but actually not doing it. And like a lot of parts of our economy, it is now well and truly captured. And if you're looking for proof of that, you only have to look at today's announcements. Because for the last 6 months to 12 months, the government has been talking a good game about how it was going to reform the sector, how it really wanted to control electricity price inflation, that it could see that there was a problem. It has focused mostly on what it sees as gas shortages caused by the Labor Green government's ban on offshore oil exploration. But any expert in the sector who has looked at this will tell you that for 20 years we've been looking for oil and gas offshore and we couldn't find it. And the prospects of finding it, even in the last 2 or 3 years when the exploration was banned, was low and unlikely to change the fundamental problem we have, which is not enough gas because our forecasts of the gas supplies were too optimistic. And we've been using a lot of the gas to do things such as turn it into methanol, which we've then exported. And also, of course, we've been using a lot of our electricity to export it in the form of aluminium. And all of these things together have meant last winter, when there was a little bit less rain, we had another crisis and a big surge in wholesale prices. And just in the last year or so, a combination of higher wholesale prices and regulated increases in lines charges by Transpower and the main lines companies has combined to produce inflation of more than 10% in electricity prices, retail electricity prices for consumers. And for those businesses who are buying retail, they're getting the double digits. And some of the wholesale electricity prices paid by businesses are growing at not just double digit, but double and treble the rates. That's why we're seeing so many factories shut down. So what is it that the government has done today? Well, it has announced that it is writing a letter to the chairs of the 3 gentailers to say, we'll support you if you want to invest money in the generation of new electricity. As if that was the problem stopping the companies from doing it. Remember, the government owns 51% of these companies and would be quite within its rights to direct it to invest rather than pay dividends. And it hasn't done that because Treasury's told the government, you do that, you're not going to get hundreds of millions of dollars in and reduce your deficit and achieve your aims of reducing debt and the size of government to under 30% of GDP. Effectively, this government and previous Labor governments have chosen to impose effectively a tax increase on the public and on businesses instead of being upfront about imposing a tax increase and also being upfront about an ideological drive to keep the size of government under 30% of GDP. So let's have a look at the problem, one suggested solution, and also what else has happened in the news in the last day or so. And to do that, I wanted to show you a lovely picture of a substation in Brooklyn, not far from where we used to live. There we go. Those who drive up that road will know that substation well, and the lines which carry a lot of electricity from the South Island over the high voltage cable over the under the Cook Strait, and then up into the rest of the North Island. So will this time be different? Sadly, the answer is no. We now know. Now, just to give you a sense, here's the prices for electricity indexed to 2015, showing that for a good period they were rising, but not too vastly faster than other prices. But in the last 2 to 3 years, they have exploded. And that is despite the amount of electricity generated in New Zealand falling. It seems strange. Why is electricity generation falling when we're all using more devices and charging our electric cars and the likes? Well, it's largely because the business sector has been demanding less electricity. The industrial users, when you shut down a pulp and paper plant or you shut down a big factory, you're going to use a lot less power. And you can see that in the electricity consumption by sector chart there, wood, pulp, paper and printing, a big collapse in the amount of electricity used, and the chemicals sector is also using less electricity. Here's the guts of the issue. So the orange there is the amount of dividends paid out to shareholders, which jumped surprisingly as soon as the three companies were listed. And the black line there is the amount that was invested in new generation. So if you're running a business and you want to make sure you pay out lots of cash dividends to your shareholders, then you don't invest. And as it turns out, if you've got a market where it makes sense to not invest, because remember, every time there's a shortage of electricity in the wholesale market, the price goes up. So what you want to do is tiptoe along the edge of a precipice, running the system right to the margins, trying to avoid shutdowns, but also generating shortages so that you get a very high marginal cost. And that's important because the marginal cost for the last little bit of electricity generated is the price that applies to all the electricity you're generating. So even the stuff that's costing you nothing. And of course, the bulk of it is hydroelectric power, which the big gentailers don't pay anything for that water. They own the big dams and plants and progressively keep raising the value of them in accounting terms and generating a return on those assets, which they argue is not extreme. It helps that you keep revaluing your assets higher. Right, just to give you an idea of how so much of this is performative, we had this strange situation yesterday where Christopher Luxon, it was actually Monday afternoon, Christopher Luxon sent a letter to Christopher Hipkins begging or asking him to adopt a bipartisan approach on gas exploration. Chris Hipkins happened to be on a plane at the time, so hadn't seen the letter, and within half an hour it was leaked to the New Zealand Herald, which wrote a piece essentially trying to embarrass Labour into not having a bipartisan position, and totally performative to give the impression and to give a short-term bump to some sort of political view, but actually doesn't change anything and doesn't win confidence in how our politics operates. Now, number of the day, just moving off piece a bit, number of today is 18.9%. That's the vacancy rate in the shops in Newmarket. That's up from around 13% a year ago, just to reinforce the issues we have with our economy, where the retail sector is in deep recession. And because we've gotten recent numbers through from the ANZ Business Outlook survey on that and other sectors. And also just to sort of push back a bit at the comments that we've seen in recent weeks from people in business and in banking and in the government who are saying, you know, we're just going to have a recovery. It's just going to be a bit slow and it's coming. It's going to be difficult when you have that sort of vacancy rate in one of our premier shopping districts. Now, here's the detail of the ANZ Business Outlook survey. And I wanted to just spend a bit of time on this just to explain how the business confidence world works, how it has worked, particularly the differences between times when Labour-led governments have been in power and national-led governments have been in power. So I've overlaid onto this chart the timeframes of the relative periods of governments by colour. So red being Labour and blue being national. So going back to 2008, you can see there's an interesting gap between the red line and the blue line. And the red line is the measure of the activity outlook. So asking businesses the questions, how do you feel about your own business in the next year or so? The blue line is, how do you feel about the economy generally over the next year or so? And when Labour governments are in power, businesses tend to say, oh, things must be bad for everyone else because Labour is in power. But actually for my business, it's doing okay. And then when National gets into power, the two lines join together. So essentially, we see the outlook the same for the economy as it is for businesses. Now, again, you can see when Labour got back into power in 2017, those gaps that gap opened up again. And then we started to see an interesting new measure of how businesses are doing. This is a new question added to the ANZ Business Outlook survey, asking the question, how is your business done in this quarter? So in the last survey, it's the September quarter versus a year ago. So not how do you think you're going to do, but how did you actually do compared to what you think you're going to do. So often the black line actually follows what's happening with how people see their own businesses going. And interestingly low, about mid to late 2023, those lines also diverged. So what that shows you is that businesses are more confident about their futures and the future of the economy once we saw a national government get in, but their own businesses actually diverged from what they thought was going to happen pretty much since mid to late 2023 and throughout. And we now have this huge gap that's opened up. And in the last 6 to 12 months, the black line has trended down and is barely at zero, i.e. hardly growing at all. And that is actually a pretty good indicator of what's happening with GDP. The reason I headline it there, perceptions, reality and experience, is that essentially this is a measure and a sign of what I call a delusion, where it's not just businesses who have it, consumers have it too, where in recent years we've seen a big gap open up between what we think is going to happen and then what actually happens in a way that confounds our experience and is also connected to our views on who should be running the country. Right, as you can see here, this is a close-up of what's happening with activity, same month versus a year ago, employment, same month versus a year ago, and then real GDP. And you can see there that activity barely increasing, slightly above the zero, employment still below the zero, and when you look at how that might follow, how it might lead GDP, you can see we're still relatively weak. We might not be contracting, but we're certainly not growing quickly or bouncing back. And just to give you a sense of how this is flowing through, the green line there is for construction, and you can see that past activity in construction is still falling. And you can see also that retail, that's the purple line, has improved so far this year, but it's still below zero. And the only areas where we've got growth are agriculture, which is important, very good export prices generally. Some of the other economy-wide areas and services. So we're talking financial services, education, health, that sort of thing. Construction, according to the ANZ Business Outlook survey, still shedding jobs and actually at a greater rate than it has been. Purple too, retail, again, and I thought it was useful to show you what was happening in the vacancy rates in Newmarket. Now, what are the problems businesses are seeing out there? Well, you can see how this has changed over time. ANZ asked the question, what are your 5 biggest problems for your business? And you can see there that the blue stuff is finding skilled labour. Now, obviously, in the latter periods of COVID, that was an issue. Access to finance, so that's the dark red, actually has never been much of an issue. And it goes to show that cutting interest rates may not help business investment that much. The light green line is low turnover. What that means is demand. So why aren't consumers buying my stuff? Now you can see during COVID there was plenty of demand. There isn't anymore. The other issue I think it's worth noting is this line competition, which is actually just a proxy in construction for there's not enough work for all of us and we're competing hard for it. And the other issue is non-wage cost inflation. Now, in construction, that's not such an issue. When we say non-wage cost inflation, that's things like interest costs, rates, fees and charges. Now, when you look at the economy-wide area, that's the very dark black line, non-wage cost inflation. Considerable increase in the last 3 or 4 years. It rose right at the end of COVID and is rising again in 2025. This, in my view, is linked to the big increases in fees, charges, rates, all sorts of levies that the government and councils can impose, in large part designed to reduce deficits and debt. And to give you a sense of how the economy was travelling in the last week or so of September after that shock Q2 GDP number, remember 0.9% contraction, you can see that the questions and answers around past employment and past activity really dived after that period when we just heard the GDP numbers. And you can sense the frustration growing in the business community. This is a quote from Sharon Zollner's note that goes out with the ANZ Business Outlook. She says, now we've taken a medicine, i.e., the economy has taken its pain after COVID. Firms would like to see things return to growth mode because they haven't yet. Now, just a heads up. Now that we've had the ANZ measure of business confidence, we should look out on next Tuesday for the quarterly survey of business opinion. This is the other one. It's a quarterly business confidence survey, longer running than the ANZ one, but it is quarterly. And also it doesn't include questions and answers from the agriculture sector, whereas the ANZ one does. And they typically move in tandem, but it's interesting when agriculture is doing well and the other parts of the economy are not, then you do see the two lines diverge, and you can see there that the ANZ survey shows more confidence in the sector, and you'd have to think some of that is due to the lack of agriculture in the sector. Now, what have we got around the traps today, scoops-wise? Turns out Wayne Brown may not serve out his full term, and Desley Simpson is his designated survivor. This is a fun one. So this is actually a scoop from AP's correspondent in Wellington, Charlotte Graham, about how Kash Patel, the FBI director, had some fun bringing in some 3D printed guns as a present for New Zealand's police forces and security arrangements. Turns out this is illegal in New Zealand. And he committed a crime by bringing it over the border, and those have now been destroyed. A good column today from Lloyd Berg going through the timeline, a TikTok on what went on with this performative. We want you to do bipartisan, and if you don't, we'll leak it, and actually leaking it before it even got to Chris Hipkins. Quote of the day, and I think this is important to reflect on some of our issues. A very good deep dive from RNZ. I've included the link in the email newsletter. This is from the person who runs a housing charity in Blenheim called Crossroads Marlborough. It's Janine Sad, who reports on big increases in demand for help with food parcels and emergency accommodation. She says she's not getting help from the government in terms of grants from the government or from donors. Our numbers are going up, i.e. number of people needing housing, but our financial supports are all down. There's just not enough of anything: money, houses, and people. Well, actually, there is enough money. It's just in a term deposit account. Certainly not enough houses. Sadly, our consents are still falling because there's a market failure there too. And there aren't enough people. That's because there's not enough funding for these organisations. And Vanya Vitasovich from the Methodist Mission, again also in Blenheim, has talked about the housing crisis there. Again, there's literally no funding for housing for Marlborough. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. It's like the tap's been completely turned off. She's talking there partly about the issues with the government turning off the taps for emergency housing through motels, but also turning off new building for Kaingaroa. The regions, it's like we're being forgotten about. So in the papers this morning, the Herald is leading with a particular example of a person who's missing. Interesting little story from Kate McNamara in the business section about IKEA getting that investment boost on a building that they'd already decided to invest in. A problem with a social housing place in Wellington. This is the council's big apartment block. In fact, right behind that Transpower substation heading up to Brooklyn. Problems with heat. Well, this is one of the issues when you have climate change. And a piece there from Henry Cook about the number of workers who are likely to go off the job later this week. The press leads with the harassment for women candidates on the campaign trail and reprints a story from RNZ about the crisis in emergency departments and the CTU proposal for a buying back shares. Again, this is in the Waikato Times today, talking about this emergency problem. RNZ today leading it last time I looked with a class action lawsuit against the Hawke's Bay Regional Council over flooding. Just imagine if you could sue the government, which, by the way, one of its measures announced today is another study of a liquefied natural gas regasification plant. These are incredibly expensive and big. The suggestion is that the taxpayer would pay for it. This is a massive subsidy for gas-powered power plants and does nothing for our emissions reduction or any attempt to try to build lots of renewables, because we could more than easily spend that money on building new solar farms and battery grid-scale batteries. Stuff has a few stories there today that mean not much, I have to say, although they have a very good series launched at the moment by Mildred Armour and others looking at the cost of living. It's well worth a read. I've included it in today's email newsletter. And sort of a pre-cooked piece from Jonathan Mills suggesting that the government would allow capital raises. So this is a look ahead to the thing that was announced today. The problem is not the gentailers feeling like they couldn't raise capital from the government. They just needed to reduce their dividends. Cartoons today focused on the quake building issues. Rod Emerson there, and we also have Sharon Murdoch with this issue of the quake rules. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's chorus for Wednesday, October the 1st on the Kaka. And if you happen to be watching this and you're not a paying subscriber, that's because I've opened it up after requests from paying subscribers for this sort of work I like to do in the public interest, but behind a paywall, if you see what I mean. Ka kite anō.